In the second set of notes that we look at in regards to the Industrial Revolution, we'll focus on the second Industrial Revolution. However, to get started, and before we even look at the second Industrial Revolution, you want to look and understand what the Agricultural Revolution was about first and foremost. So let's get started. The Agricultural Revolution was also a revolution in farming. And to understand what had happened, you need to go back to what life was like in Britain, and particularly England, before the revolution. Because if you recall from the first set of notes, it was explained how people who might have lived in the Roman or ancient Greek times would not have noticed much changes there. But at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which was around the 1750s, there was a slow but gradual change that would take place. And in fact, actually, agricultural methods had not changed all that much since the medieval times. Farmers were still using hoes, sickle, and wooden plows. And farming was organized in a three-field crop rotation system, where essentially farmers would leave one-third of the land fallow, basically empty, so they can restore the fertilizer and nutrients into the soil. The fallow field would be a place where animals would graze and do their business on, while the other two fields nearby would do the growing. And then once that season was over, the fields would be rotated. And to achieve this, it was an open field system, meaning there was no fences, and so very little actual improvement was made to the land. It was a very laissez-faire, a very laid-back and disorganized way. And the system only provided what was needed. There was no significant surplus in amount of food. Only enough food was produced or grown to feed the local population. But as the Industrial Revolution changed in areas such as the textile industry, the revolution brought many changes to farming, such as the machinery. And use of farm machinery meant that there were fewer farm workers that were needed. One machine could replace in the hands of several workers, which will allow the owners to produce more food at a lower cost. And because of that, there was displaced farm workers. And these individuals who once used to just work on the farming fields were now having to move to the cities like Liverpool, Manchester, London, etc. to find work. And this is called the rural to urban migration. Rural being the farmland, urban being the city. And with the growing populations in cities being the urban centers, they needed more food, and so more advancements along with the enclosure acts and new type of machineries would be invented to produce more food. There, more food to eat and to supply more raw materials like cotton. On this infographic, you may want to pause and explore this because what really matters is what the farming was like before the revolution and what farming was like after the revolution. Once you finish exploring this, you can continue. And like as we explored with the first industrial revolution, there was other really important inventors. Jethro Tull created the seed drill, Lord Townshend with crop rotation, Robert Bakewell for stock breeding, Arthur Young for riding, or Justus von Liebig for fertilizers. These all are major advancements needed to increase production and efficiency to produce more food at a cheaper price for the growing urban population. Eli Whitney, cotton gin, Cyrus McCormick, the reaper, and other inventions such as horse-drawn hooray, steam engines. The industrial and agricultural revolutions complemented one and another, and the developments needs to one to another to another. The necessity is the mother of invention there. And with the science too, agriculture became a science during the agricultural revolution. Farmers and governments invested more in the research. They established schools, societies, and stations. They established progress in the agriculture. There was more in use of pesticides, stock breeding, new foods, food preservation, farming techniques, irrigation, frozen foods. What all basically as a result is today in the post-industrial world that we live in today, food is grown by far fewer farmers than was 200 years ago because we are living in the post-industrial world and we can literally just go to the grocery store and pick up what is needed instead of what is currently available locally. Example of a thresher, the work, the volume with less people needed. But all these changes had also the reality that not everyone was in favor of the changes. Here, you can see in this kind of picture, the city, the farmland, the factories, the railway, the cows. Not everyone was always in favor for it. And in fact, actually, for a while, England didn't want to acknowledge that this revolution was taking place. They were either embarrassed by it, or they found it to be annoying, or they just didn't put much public effort into it. But as various world events continued to progress, then their attitude changed to more keeping their various inventions secret, so they've not been taken by rivals such as Napoleonic France. But on to now the Second Industrial Revolution. The difference between the First and Second Industrial Revolution is this. The first, or the Old Industrial Revolution, took place from 1750 to 1870. The Second Revolution was from 1870 to around 1960. In the First Revolution, places, only countries such as England, United States, Belgium, and France would industrialize. And in the First Revolution, there was fundamental changes in the farming, the development of factories, and the overall rural to urban migration. But in the Second Revolution, it was far more widespread of countries that were industrializing. Countries such as Germany, Japan, and Russia were all industrializing and were using machines such as railways as a form of nation building. There was also, in the Second Industrial Revolution, incredible high levels of mass production, especially in the anticipated demand of consumer goods, along with electrical power, electronics such as electric lights, radios, fans, and televisions were all invented during this time, along with other type of industries such as the commercial airline industry. But the Second Industrial Revolution was also more spread. In the 1800s, Britain was a world leader, yes, as they were the first to industrialize, but Britain tried to ban the export of its methods and technologies, but this effort failed. 1812, the United States would begin industrializing after the War of 1812. In 1825, after the defeat of Napoleon, France began to industrialize. Around the 1870s, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Sweden, and Switzerland also would industrialize. And by 1890, Russia and Japan were industrializing. Bit by bit, it became that domino effect of those who were industrializing for various reasons, but mainly for national pride, unity, and nation building. And with building two came incredible projects for transportation. And these projects would be on railways and also on canal building. Railways were used by industrial nations to lay their own tracks, to build their economy, to build up their colonies under their political influence. Railway construction was a big part of what is nation building, as they'll pun. Russia started the Trans-Siberian Railway. Germany had the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, or Great Britain had the Cape to Cairo Railway. These are all were substantially long, multi-year projects, but it would just increase the influence, the power, and prestige of the colonial and also the imperial powers. Canals, international shipping route canals would be used as well, like the Suez Canal to link the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, the Kiel Canal, North Sea to the Baltic Sea, or the Panama Canal from Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Even people in the United States have at times have very strong opinions about who actually owns the Panama Canal. Britain, Pax Britannia, with their Cape to Cairo Railway, as you can see on the left picture there, it's one end of the continent to the other end of the continent of Africa, with the British soldier holding like a rail, a line of track like a piece of string there. If you look closely on this map, you can see a yellow line, which indicates you almost could take a trade from South Africa all the way up to Egypt, across the Middle East, through parts of India, all the way down to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. That is a really long railway. And actually, some sections of the railway is still being used today or has been rebuilt for the purposes of today. The Trans-Siberian Railway is the longest railway in the world. Even Canada was part of the nation-building activity of railway construction, with the Pacific Railway project, followed up then by the CN Railway, Canadian National Railway, by the end of the 1800s. In the Second Revolution, there was incredible advancements in transportation, especially in cars and airplanes. Charles Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber, Gottlieb Daimler, the gasoline engine, Henry Ford, the mass assembly line, or the airplanes, the Orville and Wright brothers, the first airplane, Charles Lindbergh, the first flight non-stop across the Atlantic. This will all lead to the growth of the commercial aviation industry that we now know in the 20th and the early 21st centuries. What the gasoline engine car first looked like. It kind of looked like a horse carriage. So what were the results of the Industrial Revolution? When you think about results, there are three main factors that indicate the results: the economic changes, political changes, and social changes. These are the three areas that saw the most amount of change because of the Industrial Revolution. Economics, world trade, factory system, mass production of goods, industrial capitalism, better standard of living, and unemployment. Those happened. These are the changes in economics that happened. For politics, the aristocracy would decline. You have more democracy governments in the world. Increased government involvement in society. Increased power of countries that are industrialized, and less power to those that are not industrialized. Nationalism and imperialism became stronger, along with the power of business people. Whereas in social changes, we have cities. Women have better rights. You have leisure time. More people, population increase. But yet there are problems with economic insecurity, war became more deadly. You have slums, but yet science and research got even better. With world trade, there was increased production, meant that industrialization countries could produce more than any other country combined. And that those industrialized always were looking for new markets to sell and buy from. Those that were industrialized would buy more raw materials, more empires, more colonies, more territories. And with world trade, You continue to have more advancements in shipbuilding. Steam-powered ships will make international trade and also travel. Think about places like the Queen Elizabeth cruise liner or the Titanic would bring about tourism and more travel around the world. It's becoming more and more connected. You have other types of ships like the paddle wheel boat along the Mississippi for expansion of world trade. You have ideas like free trade, which means trade is not free, but there are no protective taxes to prevent if you want to buy a good from one country, but yet you live somewhere else. And as nations compete for markets, protective tariffs, so taxes, were put in place to limit the foreign competition within the industrialized nation and its colonies. And the motivation was to protect the business in the home country and the colonies. But this also meant people in the home country had to pay for those differences there. What the factories looked like in the second industrial revolution. Factory systems would also have economic changes because of the invention of standardized parts. Eli Whitney is popularly credited with the invention of interchangeable parts around the 1700s. But interchangeable parts had already been used in Europe before the 1700s. Each part item, like a musket, was made individually by a single person, with each part being made to fit a whole. Standardized or interchangeable parts were created en masse to make duplicates, like hundreds of muskets in the case of a battle. And then manufacturers decided upon standardizing their sizes for their goods, this will create large quantities for their components, such as deciding that musket barrels should be 2 feet long, making 100 duplicate musket barrels. Then deciding that what that trigger is for these muskets should be 2 inches tall, making them 100 2 inch. It's all about standardizing. And if you standardize, then you can mass produce more of that item faster and cheaper, which would ultimately mean that the owner would have a greater profit. Owner being the owner of the factory there, because their development costs would be cheaper because of the standardized parts. And standardized parts would be a major component for when Henry Ford would invent the mass assembly line. Here's an example of like the interchangeable parts was once again using child labor. As you can tell by the machines, this is a textile, but that shows how the textile industry had changed. Now, with Henry Ford, speaking of him, there was also different changes when it comes to economics, especially with the factories and the assembly line. Henry Ford was an American, and he developed the idea of the assembly line. And this was developed between 1908 to 1915. Henry Ford brought the work to the worker instead of the worker to the work. Well, it basically meant products move along a conveyor belt, with each worker contributing labor along the way to create a finished product. You have that particular spot on the conveyor belt that you just do over and over and over again there to create the whole entire piece there. Not exactly stimulating or exciting for the worker, but it was a stable, predictable job with a predictable result, which was good for the financial bottom line. But the changes the factory system brought about was also the divisions of labor. The assembly lines did bring work to the worker. It saved time. Each worker was specialized in one part. An automobile person who built cars may spend 30 years working in a factory, and all that person ever did was to put the passenger side door on the car, on that belt. And someone else farther down the belt would put the next door on, then next and next. There. Focusing on one aspect of the production can be repetitive, but can also make a worker an expert at that particular aspect there, which would definitely help to reduce the cost. But the changes with the factory system, manufacture, the actual term is in Latin, meaning manu and factore, which based in Latin essentially means by hand. The economic system. But during the Industrial Revolution, the meaning of manufacture switched from being the person who made the article by hand to the capitalist who hired the workers to make these articles, these items. And then workers no longer own the means of production, the hand tools, the simple hand tools that were used in the cottage system or the domestic system. Instead, newer means of production, such as machinery, would then be owned by the capitalist, the one who owned the factory, the one who hired the workers to produce the intended goods. And with the economic changes, motor vehicle production in the United States in 1895, there was only 33,000 cars in continental USA. 1910, 181,000 cars. The year 2000, 5.5 million cars were in continental USA. Factors that contribute to the mass production was the standardized parts, the interchangeable parts, the assembly line, labor division, the specialization. Mass production meant goods could also be produced at a lower cost, which means people could also afford and buy these also at a lower cost, because a Model T Ford would only cost $410. So other changes that was economic was that workers came to rely entirely on their employers for their livelihoods. No small and family farms could provide extra food. There was no day laboring or laboring farmer to make extra money. And when the factory slowed down, the worker had nowhere to go for work. While entrepreneurs had assumed risk for these new businesses, there was more workers working from home. No custom orders, so nothing was like being personalized, no at will. It was very much a structured system, which really kind of hurt like the free spirit of individuality that once existed for the domestic system. And with the changes with industrial capitalism, there was investments required to run these large industries. Capital was used to produce more wealth. An entrepreneur was a person who started a business to make profit. A capitalist was a person who invents and invests his own or her own money in a business. A corporation was the money that was owned by stockholders. The actual running of the company was left to be done by hiring managers. And these industries started to grow, and small businesses operations faded to obscurity. The relationships between the workers and business owners will change. This is the industrial capitalism, the almost like the dehumanizing of society. And with the economic changes, small manufacturers could not compete with a large business. Consumers must buy from large corporations. Workers had to fight for decent wages. Large corporations, however, can also influence the government. These are all very much common issues that still very much exist today for problems in society. But yet, at the same time, there was an increase of standard of living. Mass production made manufactured goods less expensive. People could afford them. Standard of living didn't raise for everyone, as factories had low wages, and many immigrants or those the rural to urban migration lived in poorer lives than what their parents had enjoyed there. Once again, it's that same problems that do prevail today. By also the economic changes, there was unemployment. There was overproduction or an underconsumption. Mass production was all about anticipating the demand. And the goods don't sell, so the manufacturer will have to lay off workers as it produces less of that item, which sometimes can lead to a recession. Overproduction can lead to widespread layoffs, depression, lasting recession. It's unlike the domestic system, which was making goods on order. The factories were making goods on the anticipation of it, and if it doesn't, there would be changes, hardships as a result for that. With that too was the decline of the land aristocracy. Before the revolution, power was in the hands of the land aristocracy, and this is generally where lords or dukes, nobles or lesser nobles. Though vassalage was gone by the 18th century, the working relationship between the lord and the peasants has still remained the same, with the peasants working the land for the lords, and the wealth was being based on the agriculture. Wealth was in the land there, and the land aristocracy owned and controlled most of the land, which made those who actually owned the land the wealthiest. And with the revolutions, factories became more valuable than the land. Now, with this came political changes. The middle class grew from the Industrial Revolution. The middle class gained more rights. The middle class, also referred to as the working class, began to work in the Industrial Revolution. The working class was getting rights for the workplace. They're demanding to have a voice in the government. These are all positive developments. And with that was government involvement. To meet those demands, so the governments would take actions of the workers. They would legalize unions, establish minimum wage, create forms of social security. There would be government actions to help the consumers. There would be regulations on the goods, government actions to help businesses. So it'd be more like government involvement because helping for the workers. And the changes would also come more quickly for the countries that had industrialized first. Those who had industrialized first would gain more power, and more power came more wealth. With more wealth also led to a greater influence of imperialist influence around the world, or colonies, or empires. And these imperialistic or industrialized nations would build up their navies, ships of war, or commercial vessels to protect their own interests, but also to gain more and more power. And with that, the whole feeling of nationalistic pride and imperialism, we have increased production for the raw materials. Industrialized nations will expand their colonial empires, their sphere of influence. There will be like a worldwide scramble, like the scramble for Africa. People fought for the lands that they controlled, fought one another for the colonies, fought like wars for spheres of influence. Hit the road. There was also the rise of like business people who were part of the working class, but the business people who gained political rights. They had wealth, a lot of wealth. And because they had wealth, they had more influence especially with the government. And with that growth and influence, there was also the growth of cities. Paris and London, as you can see, had vast increases in their overall populations because of the rural and urban migration. And the growth of cities would be a sign of an industrialized nation, of a large portion of their population being in their main cities or just living in a city environment. Other ones like Liverpool or Manchester would be centers of like social development and social changes rather than political or economic. With there was the improvement of status for the women. Initially, factory owners hire women and children because they work for lower wages. This brought many women who would have been impoverished otherwise to work in the factories. But governments would post laws to limit the work that women and children could do at times. But despite that limit, women still were working, which gave them a sense of independence, especially for money. And before industrialization, it was basically impossible for a woman to remain single and to live alone. There was no way for them to really to earn a living. But with factories, they could do that. And factories and urban centers attracted women in larger numbers there, and women fought for and eventually gained their own political rights at all levels of society as well as in government. And that's also the change. Another change of social was leisure time, essentially tourism. Labor saving devices on the machines in the factories or the farms to replace work. But there was also ones like vacuum machines, washers, refrigerators, um, gave people more free time. And because there was a sense of free time, there would be new forms of entertainment like motion pictures, amusement parks, travel, hotels. Traditionally, Western nations had Sunday, the day Christian day of rest, is the only day from work. Saturday was then also added because there is more time off. And with these social changes, there is still that increase in overall population. Many people immigrated to countries that had industrialized, and because that example with the United States, one of the first countries to industrialize after England, the United States had a lot of different nationalities. Irish moved to Manchester, the Liverpool in England there. The population growth of these nations grew even more and more because of food. The agricultural revolution, more food production, lower food prices, people ate more, healthier, more babies, population would grow. Europe, 1750, 144 million people. 1900, 325 million. In England, 1750 had 11 million people. By the beginning of the 20th century, 30 million people. It's all about the numbers and the change that this would bring about. But as always, when you have change, there are problems. Monotony of assembly lines in the factory life, loss of craftsmanship and manufactured goods, war became more deadly as weapons became more advanced. And there was the economic insecurity, though you can be unemployed, not meaning you have any work. There, but then there's also science and research. Scientific technological discoveries may be more profitable. Companies and governments are willing to invest in research. There are patent laws. So it's always, there's positives and negatives there, but the only thing that is constant is that sense of change. Another aspect in the second industrial revolution was the labor movement. Going back again to the domestic and factory system, domestic workers and employers knew each other personally. Workers could become employers. But in the factory system, workers no longer owned the means of production because of the machinery and the interchangeable parts. Employers no longer knew the workers personally. Factories were run by managers. There was no relationship between the employees or the employers. And with the factories, they tend to be crowded, dark, and dirty. Workers work from dawn to dusk. Young kids will work with dangerous machines because they're cheap. Employment of women and children put men out of work. Women and children are paid less. There's also the poor living conditions. Factories were driven by profit. Businesses largely running into the problems of workers. But yet you also have factory towns. Towns built by employees around the factories to house the workers. Workers change for higher prices normally than for rent or groceries. Workers became indebted, so they owed money to the same company that they worked for. It's almost like indebted gratitude. There was these slum conditions, factory towns built or owned by the factories. The conditions were poor. Now this picture really just shows what those kind of slum conditions were like. Slums are very poor locations. And slums is not a strange concept to the rural urban migration who are used to living on the lord's estate or property. But slum conditions were full of crowded tenants. There was few amenities. Tenants who lived in there were done by multiple people. Apartment buildings had more of a negative connotation, even though today is more viewed as freedom, individuality, and urban. But in the second revolution, this was a negative. They were overcrowded and sanitary. Workers were unsatisfied working in the factory and living outside of the factory. Like this picture really shows that message. Or the kind of factory homes that are built in rows. Today it's more kind of like or suburbia, cookie cutter per se. But actually in England now, this is kind of almost like a British identity. These row homes and the bricks. But back in the Revolution time, this was dingy. This was poor. But all these kind of social changes would lead to the rise of labor unions. Before labor unions, workers bargained individually in individual contracts. Before factories, a worker could bargain for a better wage, better working conditions, because they can argue based upon their individual skill. But with factories, rather than a domestic system, factories, work was routine. One worker can be replaced by another. Workers were like those interchangeable parts. So because of that, a union would be formed. Workers would form a union to have like a collective group and have a collective bargaining contract, same salary, same working condition there. Organized groups of workers will elect leaders to bargain on their behalf instead of having essentially labor unions, you are together. Whereas before, you're like the lone wolf. You are individual or you are together. Even here in British Columbia, unions are, they used to be a really powerful part of society in BC. And one of the most powerful tools the workers have is the right to strike. And strike means to refuse work if you don't have a contract. And the quote unquote weapons that could be used by both the employers or the employees. Employers can blacklist, to individual bargain, injunctions, lock shops, outsourcing, relocations, layoffs for we had unions can boycott, close shop, collective bargaining, lobbying, picketing, strikes. It really sets up the conversation that still very much is today. You're on the employer side or you're on the union, the employee side. There was legal protection for workers. Eventually, ours will be limited for women. Later, working towards equal pay. Eventual end to use of child labor. School requirements for school attendance will grow there, so kids can still work, but they have to be in school for a certain amount of time. Health and safety codes were improved. Minimum wage was established. Unions were made legal. So despite these struggles, there was some positive progress. The rights of female child workers, while women and children could legally be paid less than men for the same work, and factory owners were more willing to hire them, this did make the men rather resentful, especially towards the child laborers. And England had a history going back to the 1700s of training pauper children, even those longer than 5, to be in the trade there. Poor children will follow their mothers in factories. Every male-dominated union would banish women and children from the workplace. Eventually, though, all these kind of strategies would be abandoned, and eventually women will win the right to have equal pay, equal work. Even though today, it's not really in reality that women and men make the same amount. That is still very much a work in progress. But this chart kind of shows how that evolved for social insurance and security in some of the most industrialized countries. And to end, this is review questions. But one last thing I want to explore, and this is a little bit of a plug for next year, is the cooperative movement or socialism with Karl Marx or Louis Blanc. Socialism basically are socialists who view capitalism as wrong. They believe that capitalism is designed to create poverty and poor working conditions because of its end goal. The goal is to earn and maximize profit for the investors there. The socialist hates capitalism. But a socialist government would be a way to means the production. And they believe that government, the people, owns the mean of production. And these factories and industries will function in the public instead of being in a private. And Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, was a German socialist, i.e., basically what we would think of as communism. He was forced to leave Prussia for articles that criticized the Prussian government. He relocated to France, but he was thought to be too radical. But Karl Marx helped write the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels in 1848. And the Communist Manifesto is all about like the proletariat, the worker, the violent revolution to create like this perfect worker paradise and to overthrow the aristocracy and the factory owners. And it's all about, well, basically these four values. How history is interpreted through economics, the violent struggle between classes, the value of surplus, and the inevitability success of socialism. And that would essentially conclude our look into the Industrial Revolution.